an architecture media podcast, supported by the Australian Institute of Architects, produced on Boonwurrung country.
Welcome to Design Speaks Weekly, a podcast that explores the biggest stories in Australian architecture and design. I'm your host, Georgia Burks, and today I'm joined by Nigel Bertram, Director of Melbourne-based practice NMBW Architecture Studio. We speak about research-led design and how we can measure a building's success. But first, here's the latest news headlines from Architecture AU.
In the news this week, the Australian Institute of Architects has announced the winners of the Greater Brisbane Regional Architecture Awards for 2026. Anala Infill Apartments by Baber Studio and Plant Futures Facility by M3 Architecture were among the most highly awarded projects, each taking home 3 titles. And Powerhouse Parramatta, one of Australia's most significant new cultural institutions, will open in late 2026. The $915 million museum building in Western Sydney is now complete, with exhibition spaces currently being fitted out. And finally, Architecture Media has launched a new awards program recognising excellence in Australian landscape architecture and design. The Landscape Australia Awards, presented by Landscape Australia, highlight how innovative design can shape better environments for both human and non-human communities. Those are the headlines for this week. For the full stories and more news, visit architectureau.com. I'm Adair Winder. It's Tuesday, May 5.
Nigel Bertram, Director of NMBW Architecture Studio and Practice Professor of Architecture at Monash University, maximises the relationship between practice and academia, allowing research to inform and guide his studio's projects. In this episode, Nigel reflects on the opportunities for innovation through research-led design and speaks to the value of post-occupancy evaluations. Hello, Nigel, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Georgia. Nice to be here.
Nigel, we are undoubtedly living through a time of global challenges, from social cohesion to housing affordability to a larger ageing population and, of course, the impacts of climate change. Many architectural academics are researching these issues to explore solutions, and yourselves included in that. How do you leverage the work and research you do in academia in your architectural practice?
Firstly, I don't think of them as being separate. I think, if you like, they're two different forms of research or finding out about things. And sometimes the right method might be something more traditionally academic. It might be interviewing people or visiting sites and observing things and documenting that. And sometimes it might be through a process of going through a design action and then even building that design and seeing how it plays out, or what the learnings can be from that experiment in construction. So some things might be easier than you think, and some things might be more difficult than you think, and some things might be more or less significant than you might have thought of at the start of that process. So, I think in everyone who's working in sort of design research, like design is thought of as a form of research, and research can also be done to inform design. And so you can spend ages thinking about those two words and what they really mean. But yeah, they're kind of tools for inquiry.
And how does your office get involved in what you've been working in at university?
It's a sort of a two-way or cyclical. It's very cyclical, actually. I think the first thing is it's a mindset. So if we can think of a project as a research project, no matter what it is, like we're trying to think of its broader implications, like its utility, not just to the client at hand or the site at hand. We've got to think outside of the site and outside of the brief, at the same time as satisfying the brief. So in other words, the question is, what's the bigger picture? And I think architects do this all the time. So when you design a house, you're not only trying to make a nice place for that person or family or group to live, you're also thinking about what is a house actually? Like what do we mean by living and what are our biases and what's our inbuilt kind of default that we need to question or be more aware of? So I think it's very natural for good designers to think of every project as a research project. It's just that doesn't often get kind of written up or like taken to that next level. It's more implicit for other people to discover, perhaps, or for a historian or a critic to unpack. So I guess what we do is try to sort of have different voices in our heads, so we can sort of be doing something and then later on sort of thinking about it and maybe turn from a project, you have an idea for a research project that might emerge from that, or a class, a design class you might teach. And that goes the other way as well. So again, the same sort of answer, like the practice and the academic work are actually just one thing. And they cross-influence it. They have lots of opportunities for cross-influence.
Nigel, some large architecture firms have in-house research labs to inform designs, and as you've just discussed, you've sort of established a model that allows a relatively small practice to be research-led. What's your advice to smaller firms or those who might not have direct access to the world of academia like you do? What's your advice to them on how to implement a research-led design process? Where could they start?
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's in the mindset, right? So the first thing is to think of it as a research activity as well as a functional activity or a money-making activity. Like it's actually not you're producing knowledge by doing this. That's sort of the definition of research. There's some kind of new knowledge that emerges. And the other is it's quite good to get out of the office. So, get involved with teaching. A lot of young architects or small practitioners teach for very pragmatic reasons, so they've got some regular income, but also because you go a bit nuts just being in the office, like looking at Laminex catalogues or whatever. So you have to think of a way to expand your mind, and teaching is a really great way of doing that. So, in a classical way universities are run, they talk about your teaching role, your research role, and your kind of service or leadership role. But again, they're very artificial distinctions. So at Monash, we talk a lot about research-led teaching. And all teaching is also research. If you think of it as a group research project, that everyone has a little piece to play in. So teaching is a great and very easy and achievable step into that world, and how far you then push it into a more sort of a long-term 3-year research grant kind of world where you have big teams, that's up to you.
And I guess also interacting with different ideas and opinions in that kind of group research-led conversation would be really refreshing and,
totally.
As you said, expand your knowledge for design.
I mean, that's one of the great things that the academic world can bring is other experts. You can really talk outside of architecture. You can think about, well, how does my method, how did the way I approach a problem differ from the way a social scientist or a engineer or a IT person might think about this problem? And they're pretty interesting because you have different worldviews, and you have to actually sort of find the way of talking different languages to make a really collaborative project come through, much more so, I think, than you do with a consultant team. So when you're working with of course, you're talking with different disciplines, but they're all in the construction industry. When you're in an academic context, you're often talking well outside the industry, so you have to be quite clear on the meta questions. I mean, I suppose that's the other thing to say, is that what turns a project into a research project might be just that you can articulate a research question, which is a kind of fundamental requirement for a project. You've got to say, well, what is the question I'm asking here?
And then that drives your decision
and
making.
it could be something like that. I think all architects probably ask in their head is a question like, well, what actually is a house when we talk about a house? That's a kind of, you could turn that into a research question very easily.
As you've sort of touched on, there's lots of different ways you can do research, but I'd like to focus in on post-occupancy evaluation, which is also a valuable research tool for architects, but they are notoriously hard to undertake. You've recently had some success of doing this with St Albans Housing, which is a collaboration between NMBW Architecture Studio and Monash Art Design and Architecture Urban Lab. And the project tested a new model for multi-residential living for those with high needs and for ageing in place. Can you share how the evaluation of St Albans came about, and what impact has the evaluation had on other developments like this?
I suppose we should say that the St Albans project, the building, first of all, came about through another research project. So this is a kind of interesting and quite rare, but almost to me an ideal process, where we had this research project that was a 3-year funded thing looking at age-friendly cities, and we sort of conflated two projects actually that were separately funded. One was looking at age-friendly cities, and one was looking young people living with disabilities and what kind of spaces or living conditions might enable them to be more independent. And out of that, a range of different projects came, but one of them, our partner was Housing Choices Australia. That was a linkage grant. And they had real sites. So we were already trying to preempt this by saying we're going to choose some real projects as our case studies, not just make up a hypothetical project. So we had a real site. And then eventually it turned out that they needed to do something there. So we got extra funding, or they did. We helped them to get innovation funding to build a prototype project, testing a different model. So we were very consciously in that project testing something that hadn't been done. And then it got built and people moved in and all that stuff, and it's published, people can find it. But having been set up like that, but we were consciously testing 3 or 4 key ideas that came out of the research as very strong, came out of the preliminary research as being very strong ideas that could have benefits. We then had an automatic brief for the post-occupancy evaluation, because we said, go, rightio, now we've done it, let's go back 18 months later and see how it played out. And so that's, again, it's a bit formal compared to most projects, but in a way, every project has that. You have your sort of aims and ambitions and things you think you're going to do, then you go and do it, and then you can go back and say, well, did it turn out the way we thought? Just this was a little bit more explicit. And so knowing that we sort of had to do this really to complete the cycle, to make it as useful as possible, we applied for funding from the Alistair Swain Grant Foundation, just a small grant to enable us to really do this properly. And we pulled together a team, so people from our office and people from Monash University and from University of South Australia, and thought about what sort of extra disciplinary input we wanted to talk about, not just architectural value, but also social value, and not just the building success, but the management success of it, so the hardware and the software. So we constructed a team. And then we designed a research method, right? So we said, rightio, we're not just going to rock up and look around, but we know that a lot of post-occupancy evaluations are like surveys where you go around and say, on a scale between 1 and 5, how would you rate your happiness, or something like that. They're, to my way of thinking, not very useful. I mean, they're probably useful for something.
They have a specific agenda.
They have a role. You can create data out of them,
yes,
which is why you can create statistics. But we were not interested in statistics. So we had a very small set. We had 7 people, and we had to recruit them in a certain way with ethics approval. So you can't just knock on their door. You have to invite them, and they can say no. It's very hard for people who are disadvantaged in some way or not fully empowered perhaps to be bothered or want to see, like, what's in it for me is a very reasonable question. And then we got agreement after, it took about a year to get agreement. So they're very slow.
A year from the building being complete?
Well, we started at 12 or 18 months after completion. Okay. And then it took a year from even asking people, trying to set up interviews, to getting the interviews done. Wow. And we only did 4 interviews, I think. But they were very in-depth. So we had our method of interviews and observation. And the interviews were like an in-depth discussion around set questions, and the observation was just seeing exactly what people had done and documenting it. So where was the stuff? Where did you put your things? What sort of things were piled up in the corner? And we photographed it and drew it up. So that's very spatial, and they tell you different things. So the method was set up consciously so that we would find some things out by talking to people that you couldn't see, and some things that people wouldn't say but you could see by observing.
What you found through that evaluation answered the question that you were looking for?
Yeah, I think just one other thing on method is that, like, you have to be prepared going into a post-occupancy evaluation for failure. You have to be prepared that you find out it wasn't great, right? And in order to get around that kind of affirmative bias, or whatever you call it, that we might have as designers, the people involved in the project were not involved in the interviews or the observation. We just sent different people on the team in who hadn't been involved in the design or construction phase. And that was useful to get a bit of objectivity and distance. We found some surprising things. As usual, some things are like way more important than you thought, and some things were pretty well useless. And that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I guess that sort of speaks to the value of doing these measurements or evaluations. Has what you found had influence on future developments with housing choices?
I think everyone's very interested in, I mean, the big learning from that study, if you read it, it's available online, is how significant to these people being involved in the design process for the interior was. Even though they actually had quite a limited set of choices, the fact that they were brought into the cold shell or the warm shell, and we could talk to them just for 45 minutes about how they lived, what furniture they had, what was important to them, and they could make some choices about where walls went, and they could also put things on the floor that suited them. It had a huge impact on them. So in terms of reward for investment, that was really positive. The difficult thing now is that Housing Choices are finding is, how do you upscale that? Because it's, even though it's very time efficient, it's quite unconventional in terms of the way buildings are procured and tenanted. So that's now another research project. You go, okay.
We've gone full circle.
So that's the next one that we have to do.
Fantastic.
And we've been trying to find the right vehicle to do it with Housing Choices, but you've got to get funding and all that stuff, yeah.
I'll keep my ear out for that one, Nigel. In your opinion, as we've talked about, post-occupancy evaluations are quite challenging to execute. In your opinion, without a formal post-occupancy evaluation, how can we measure a building's success?
I think, again, it's a thing that most good architects would do just naturally, right? You go back and you see how things are going. I think the difference is you've got to take off the rose-coloured glasses and see it warts and all. And like we really said to people in this one, like, don't clean up, just don't do anything. We just want to come and see how you live. And there's no wrong answer, right? Just show us just let us in, and if it's okay to take some photos. And they never wanted to be any of the photos, of course, but they were happy for us to photograph their things. And once they got over the embarrassment of that, then it became real. Because if people clean up, it's like when you have guests over, you don't see the real you don't always see the real life that goes on. So we were trying as much as possible to see the real life, and then you can learn from it.
Observations.
Yeah, observation, like meaningful observation and repeated observation over different seasons, every project would have a different set of variables. It could be time, it could be different people using the space, different tenants, or, all sorts of differences that you might try to measure.
I think that's a great answer, Nigel. Look, to end our episode, I want to ask you a question we ask all our guests, which is, what's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Well, there's probably lots of things. A couple I can think of directly from that study. I've kind of changed my mind a bit about communal space in apartments. Like, we learnt that it was basically not used at all, anything that was shared in there, yet the private internal spaces were used wildly in really amazing ways. So my current thought on, shared spaces or communal space in apartments is that it's not always good. It's usually presented as a good, as a thing you should have, or in some cases you must have. I would question that now. And the other thing I've thought of that's changed a little bit is around housing is greenfield development. Like, we've never really been involved, but we're currently doing this pattern book project in Sydney, which is another kind of research and built project, and we're building a series of terraces in a greenfield suburb that's actually quite interesting. It's a sort of old military site, so it's sort of infill and greenfield at the same time. But you can really achieve something when you start from scratch that you can't achieve in an infill situation. So maybe in certain cases, with the right ambitions and the right set of caveats, greenfield is maybe not always bad. That's a few changes.
Very interesting answers there, Nigel. Thank you so much for sharing, and it's been an absolute pleasure as always to speak with you. So thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Georgia.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode, which is supported by the Australian Institute of Architects. If you're enjoying this podcast, be sure to subscribe, share, or leave a rating. I'm Georgia Burks, and this has been Design Speaks Weekly. Design Speaks Weekly is produced on Boonwurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture.